Welcome back to the Daily Living Jewish Kitzur Shulchan Aruch class. We are on section 72, where we speak about Shabbos sanctity and preparing for Shabbos. The first of approximately 20 chapters speaking about the different elements of Shabbos that are touched upon in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. We spoke about the greatness of Shabbos, not desecrating it, the reward for it, buying for Shabbos already on a Friday morning, if not earlier, about the men being in the kitchen, the idea of making challah, having delicious food, a set home. Even the poor should try to push themselves to do something extra for Shabbos. We should stop work already Friday afternoon, earlier in the day. We shouldn't have a serious meal, so we won't have an appetite coming into Shabbos. And more recently, we spoke about reading the parsha in advance, showering and going to mikveh, cutting one's nails and hair. A good time to do that is in honor of Shabbos. And we spoke about teshuvah. Let's take a look at, we are up to approximately halacha 21. So the last few halachas we got into some detail as far as having food in the oven when Shabbos comes in. So I'm just going to discuss one or 2 points outside without getting into the details inside, because things are done a little differently now in the way it was done about 100 or so years back when the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch was written. Okay, so here we go. The prohibition of not doing work on Shabbos is only to actually do it on Shabbos. But if you don't do anything on Shabbos and you just set things up in advance, then there's no problem. Which is why, for example, you're allowed to use a time switch. Even though the time switch makes the lights go on and off, and you cause the lights to turn on Shabbos, since you didn't do anything on Shabbos and you set everything up in advance, it's not a problem. So similarly, are you allowed to cook on Shabbos? So one of the forbidden activities of Shabbos is cooking. Forget about fire. Even if there's no issue of fire, just the very act of cooking is something that the Torah forbids on Shabbos. So, but that means that you can't do something on Shabbos to make food cook. If, on the other hand, you put a pot onto the fire before Shabbos, while the food was still raw, and then you let it stay on the fire when Shabbos came in, are you doing anything on Shabbos? No. So there shouldn't be any problem with that, except the rabbis knew that, what's going to happen when you have food on the fire, you want to make sure that it's not being undercooked, it's not being overcooked. You might come and by mistake play with the fire, raise the fire a little bit, lower the fire a little bit, stalk the coals, maybe stir the pot, and all those activities would be activities of cooking on Shabbos. So to protect a person from coming to actually break Shabbos by doing an act of cooking on Shabbos, they said the only way you could set something up before Shabbos to be able to continue to cook by itself on Shabbos is if you have somewhat of a safeguard in place to ensure that you won't come to break Shabbos proper. So what is that in very practical terms? In practical terms, that's a blech. I don't know if you've heard of the term blech before. It's a Yiddish word, but what it means is if you put a metal pan over the fire, and then you put your pot on top of that metal pan, and then you also put some kind of covering over the knobs, then you won't come to play with the fire on Shabbos because you have a reminder there. The fact that you've placed something between the fire and the pot, and the fact that you've put a cover by the knobs, so that those things will remind you that you won't come to play with the fire on Shabbos, so then you can. So you can set up your challah to cook before Shabbos and allow it to cook into Shabbos, and that way, as long as you put up your blech, as long as you put up that reminder, you put something between the fire and the pot, and you put something over the handles, so that will remind you not to play around with it on Shabbos. It's worth mentioning that there were certain sects of the Jewish people that were called Karaim. Forgot what they were referred to in English, maybe Sadducites, I'm not sure. Either way, they said that but when it says that no work should be done on Shabbos, it means that not only can't you do work, but you can't let any work happen. So these Jews wanted to say that not only can't you actively cook on Shabbos, but you can't allow anything to continue cooking into Shabbos. And they brought proof for it from the verse. The problem was that they didn't believe in the oral tradition. So when Moses went on the mountain and he received the Torah, Hashem said, write this down. And this I don't want you to write down, but I want you to remember it. Certain things need to be said, and certain things need to be written, and certain things need to be said. But the Karaim didn't believe in the oral tradition. They said that what was written, and that's all that exists. And so they said, since in the Torah it says no work should be done, it means that not only can't you do something on Shabbos, but you can't even do something for Shabbos which will cause one of the forbidden labors to continue to take place on Shabbos. They were wrong, because the oral tradition taught that the prohibition is precisely before Shabbos. But once Shabbos comes in, we're allowed to cause a forbidden labor to happen if it was all set up in advance. In order to show our support for the words of the sages, so it became a universal Jewish custom to specifically have food cooking on Shabbos in the way that the rabbis established, with a blech, with that reminder between the food and the fire. Which is why, practically speaking, we have a cholent. I mean, it's very nice. Cholents are delicious. But is it that we can't go a day without some steaming hot food? Just keep it simple. 6 days a week you'll cook, and on the 7th day you'll have some salami, you'll have some, bultai. You can have lots of chicken salad. There's plenty of cold foods that you can have that are delicious. So you have to have your food hot, especially in a staunching summer day when you're all boiling anyways. You're not looking for additional hot food. Understand a midwinter day, but the Jewish custom, Jewish tradition is every Shabbos of the year to have a challenge. There's no law in that regard. There's no requirement, but that's what Jews do. You have a challenge. Why do we have a challenge? To show support for the words of the sages, that in case the Karaim say that this would be a violation of Shabbos by allowing the challenge to continue to cook on Shabbos, we specifically make that challenge cook on Shabbos in a kosher way by having that blech in place. And that way we uphold the words of the sages that said that although you're not allowed to do something on Shabbos, but if you set it up in advance, then that's not a problem. Is that clear?
How do you turn it off? So now it's hot and you're ready to eat, and when you finish, you're not allowed to turn. I'm assuming if you're cooking with gas.
Yeah, so I think traditionally in gas, people would have maybe they would also have how would people do it? I mean, once upon a time before gas was around, so the fire would eventually burn out.
Sure.
But once there is gas around, I mean, if you have a hot water kettle on it, then that probably makes it safer. But you want space for your cholent as well. If you had both of them, half on the fire, then maybe you'd be able to. I think you'd be able to take the cholent off and then move the hot water a little bit further in. But you can't put something onto a fire on Shabbos, because then you're going to generate the process on Shabbos. It all needs to be set up in advance. There is leniency to ask a non-Jew to, or in advance of Shabbos, because on Shabbos you shouldn't talk about day matters, but in advance of Shabbos there is leniency to ask a non-Jew that, can you come in tomorrow at 3 o'clock and turn it off to prevent a fire hazard. In Israel, they do have it's a gas time switch. It's quite fascinating. It's a little thing that you get your technician, your gas installer, to put onto the gas, and it's kind of like a timer on a spring. And after a certain amount of hours, you kind of wind it up however much time you want, and then it just ticks, and then eventually it shuts. So that would actually
the same like
pardon?
The same like putting a timer of Shabbat.
Yeah, but I'm saying people aren't familiar with the gas time switch, but I'm saying in Israel they actually have such a thing.
Okay.
I'm not getting into, I don't know how ideal it, I don't see any problem with it at face value, because it's all set up in advance. But still, before you purchase one of those, consult your local Orthodox rabbi, because I haven't looked into it thoroughly. As far as electricity is concerned, so that is obviously very easy, because you just have not so easy. So if you're using a stove, so then you're not going to have a time switch on your stove unless you do. So actually, when we moved into the house, we installed a time switch because every stove, requires its own fuse in the switchboard. It's the law. So you could just get an electrician to allocate the fuse for the stove, and then you could actually put a time switch into your electric board. So I actually set that up. On a regular Shabbos, you could only make the time switch make it turn off. You can't make the time switch turn it on, because then you would be causing something to start cooking on Shabbos. So that we don't do. It needs to have already been on the fire in advance of Shabbos. But on Yom Tov, you're allowed to cook on Yom Tov, but you're not allowed to make a fire on Yom Tov. So on Yom Tov, when Yom Tov comes around, we actually use the time switch to make we have a gas stove. Sorry, we have an electric stove. We actually have the time switch make the electric stove turn on and off at certain hours. So maybe we have like one of those stovetop kettles just to keep there, so it's not just in case there's nothing on it. But whatever it is, every day on Yom Tov, from 12:30 to 2, the fire's on from 12:30 to 2, and that's our cooking time. So anything we want, we go and we cook stuff up, and then at 2 o'clock it turns off. And then also before supper time on Yom Tov, the stove turns back on by itself and turns back off by itself. So that's we have in our home. But what I think the most practical thing is people get special appliances just for Shabbos because it's just most practical. So what they'll do is they'll get a hot tray, and then that you could just plug into a time switch. So they'll get a hot tray and they'll cook the cholent on the hot tray. That's what we use. We actually already cook it up before Shabbos, and then we just put it on the hot tray. It's able to continue cooking into Shabbos, and that's designed specifically for that. Also, these hot trays don't have any knobs. You don't need to worry about covering the knobs so you won't turn up and down the flame. I mean, really, you could get a hot tray anywhere, but in Israel, they have ones that have especially been designed for Shabbos, where there are no knobs or switches. There's no concern about playing around with the fire. And then you just plug it in. You don't even need a time switch because it's just a hot tray, and it's made to stay on for extended amounts of time. So if you have it in a safe place, it could stay on. It's just wasting electricity. So yeah, it's worth getting a time switch for that. So that's what people use for the cholent or for the chicken soup or both. So we have one of those. It's a large plate, and we have space for chicken soup and the cholent, and then we take the chicken soup off and leave the cholent on for the next day. Finally, people get a hot water urn, so that's also something easy to get. So the hot water urn also stays on the whole time. You don't need to boil the kettle. So even somebody who's not yet fully Shabbos observant, the first step towards that would be, when you're having your coffee on Shabbos morning, you don't want to boil the kettle, because then you're doing the two violations. It's like making a fire, because you're turning it on and you're actually heating up water, which is cooking. But if you just get a regular hot water urn and you just let the urn boil, like people have for functions, and then you just take the water out of the pot, then what you would actually do is so now you've resolved the issue of having to heat up your water on Shabbos, because it's all set up before Shabbos. You need a little bit of things to know about. For example, if you're going to put it on a high flame, if you're going to put the dial on the highest, the water's probably going to boil out before the end of Shabbos. So you put it on a lower number, and it's still pretty hot, but at least it doesn't boil out. And you fill it up much more than what you need, so it doesn't boil out. And then if you're going to pour straight from the kettle into your cup of coffee, so then what actually happens is the coffee can still get cooked by this boiling hot water. So that you're not cooking the water, because that happened by itself, but you are cooking the coffee. So what do? So you first pour the hot water out of the urn into what's called a klisheni, a second cup. And then you add the coffee, or you put it even to a third cup, and then you add the coffee by moving the hot water out of its original source of heat and putting it into a separate container, so that reduces its ability to cook. And so then at that point, it's just making the coffee hot. It's not actually cooking it. And then you resolve the issue of cooking on Shabbos. So this is just, I guess, a little bit of a practical 101. So practically speaking, people get a hot water urn and either a platter, either a hot plate, or you also get these crock pots. Crock pot is something that's actually, it cooks your cholent inside the actual crock pot. So you don't need to even have a flat plate. If you just want to have your cholent, you can plug your cholent into the wall. Again, you could have it on a time switch so it doesn't stay on. But if it does stay on, it's made for that. It's okay if you take the cholent out and that element of the inside stays on. At most, the worst you'll be doing is wasting electricity. Although if you are using a crock pot, do you know what I mean by a crock pot? Are you familiar with that? Is that a common term, a crock pot? Yes? Crock pot is, are you familiar with that, John?
Yes. Yes.
The only thing is, if you are using a crock pot, then again, you need to have your blech. You need to have your reminder that you won't play around with the fire on Shabbos. So what you would do is you would put a layer of silver foil between the metal element and the actual food. So that way you have something between the food and the fire, and that acts as a reminder. But then you'd also put a little piece of tape over the actual knob to remind you not to play around with it on Shabbos. Now, there's a lot more to learn, and I'm sure we'll cover it in the chapters to come. Like, for example, you also wouldn't be allowed to stir the cholent, because that's an act of cooking. So you could allow the cholent to cook, but as long as you have reminders not to do anything to make it cook on Shabbos, and as long as you don't actually do anything that makes it cook on Shabbos, which actually means, practically speaking, if you want to dish out some cholent or chicken soup from a pot, you need to actually take it off the fire before dishing out, because if you're going to dish out while it's still on the fire, then you'll be cooking it. You're mixing it, and you're mixing it. That's an act of cooking. So you'll actually take it off the fire first and then dish out. And if you're planning on putting it back on the fire, then you shouldn't put it down, because if you put it down, then it's like now it's a new act of cooking on Shabbos. So it becomes a two-person job. Anyhow, these are a lot of details I'm throwing out there, but it's all under the general question of how do you actually allow food to cook on Shabbos? So giving you a number of solutions. Of the time switch, or a hot plate, or a crock pot, hot water urn. But the idea is that you want to specifically have something hot on Shabbos to give strength to the words of the sages that it's nothing wrong for something to cook on Shabbos. The problem is only when it cooks up in advance of Shabbos, as long as you do it in a permissible way, meaning that you actually set it all up in advance of Shabbos. So that was a little bit of one-on-one on how we can allow cooking to take place on Shabbos in a way that not only aren't we breaking Shabbos, but it actually becomes a good thing, because we're upholding the words of the sages. Please God, tomorrow we'll speak more about this and other ways to get ready